This is a witch hunt. The words detonated in the Senate hearing room like they always did when Ilhan Omar launched them with the velocity of absolute moral certainty. The rhythm of someone who had survived being hunted before and learned that survival means never backing down. The volume of a woman who discovered early that silence is complicity, and complicity gets you erased. This is a witch hunt against Somali Americans. You are weaponizing this committee, this chamber, this moment to criminalize an entire community. This is Islamophobia dressed up as oversight, and every single American watching should be afraid of what this means. She was standing. Protocol said witnesses sit, but Ilhan Omar had built a career on doing exactly what protocol said not to do. Her finger was extended toward the presiding officer's chair, rigid as a rifle barrel, her voice flooding the Russell Senate office building hearing room with the practiced rage that had transformed her into simultaneously the most celebrated and most vilified member of the United States House of Representatives. The man in that chair was J.D. Vance, Vice President of the United States. He sat motionless, hands clasped on the mahogany surface before him. No reaction to the finger, no reaction to the decibel level. No shift in posture, no reach for water, no glance toward counsel, none of the tells people exhibit when someone's screaming at them. He sat the way someone sits who grew up in a house where screaming was baseline communication, where his mother's boyfriend bellowed and his mother bellowed back and police cars showed up and left and showed up again. And the only human who never raised her voice was his grandmother who spoke softly, because she'd learned in the Kentucky hills that quiet people command attention. He waited, let Omar finish. Let the silence accumulate, 2 seconds, 3, 4, long enough for C-SPAN's cameras to capture the contrast in high definition, her fury, his stillness, the spectacle of opposites. Then he spoke, and the voice that emerged was Southern Ohio incarnate, Appalachian at the edges, unhurried, deliberate. The voice of someone who'd written a best-selling memoir about poverty and understood precisely how to deploy a story the way an attorney deploys evidence. Congresswoman Omar, he said, I appreciate your presence today. Before we proceed with the committee's questions, I'd like to share something that's not in your briefing materials. Something personal. He paused, not theatrical pause, memory pause. I grew up in Middletown, Ohio. My mother was addicted to oxycodone and heroin. She cycled through rehabilitation, relapse, boyfriends, and evictions so many times that by age 12 I stopped keeping count. My biological father terminated his parental rights before I was old enough to comprehend what that meant. I lived with my grandmother, Bonnie Vance. Everyone called her Mama. She'd left Jackson, Kentucky with an 8th grade education and a temper that could strip paint, because she was the only adult in my universe who remained sober long enough to keep me alive. I ate government cheese, I wore Goodwill shoes. I ate school lunch because that was the largest meal I'd consumed that day. My town was dying, steel mills closing, opioid epidemic annihilating families. People I knew personally overdosing in bathrooms and parking lots. I witnessed it. I lived inside it. He looked directly at Omar. I'm not lecturing you from privilege, Congresswoman. I'm asking you from the identical place you originated. Poverty, struggle, a system that abandoned people like us. The difference between us isn't our starting point. We both started at zero. The difference is what we chose to do with the opportunity America provided. When this country gave me an opportunity, I enlisted in the Marine Corps and deployed to Iraq. When this country gave you an opportunity, you used your congressional seat to describe the September 11th attacks as some people did something, to compare America's military to the Taliban, to author legislation that enabled $250 million in fraud. I'm not targeting your religion. I'm not targeting your community. I'm asking what your constituents in Minneapolis are asking. What did you do with the opportunity this country gave you? Silence. The kind that recalibrates reality. The kind where 40 senators and 200 spectators and a dozen cameras simultaneously realize the hearing they anticipated is not the hearing they're about to witness. To understand how they arrived here, the vice president and the congresswoman from Minnesota's 5th district, two people who both knew childhood hunger, sitting opposite each other in a room constructed from marble and mahogany and 2 centuries of democratic tradition. You have to rewind to the morning, to the hours before, when both still believed they knew exactly how this would conclude. Ilhan Omar arrived at Russell Building at 8:15, surrounded by her attorney, her chief of staff, and 2 communications staffers who'd spent 72 hours constructing what they called, in crisis management shorthand, the playbook. The playbook was straightforward because it always worked. When Republicans attacked Ilhan Omar, the attack was invariably about the same thing: her identity. Muslim, Somali, immigrant, hijab. Representative of a district Republicans love demonizing. Every attack, regardless of its stated subject, financial disclosures, campaign finance, foreign policy statements, the Feeding Our Future scandal, was fundamentally about who she was rather than what she'd done. And the defense against identity attacks is identity defense. They'll target Feeding Our Future, said her attorney Rachel Stein, former DOJ prosecutor who'd navigated 6 congressional investigations. They'll attempt connecting you to the fraud through the Meals Act. Standard guilt by association. We respond with the bill was designed to feed children during a pandemic. The fraud was perpetrated by criminals who exploited a program. The suggestion that you're responsible for criminals' actions is identical logic to blaming every Muslim for terrorists' actions. Then they'll pivot to your public statements. Some people did something. The AIPAC tweet, the Taliban comparison, all ancient history, everyone litigated in media for years. We don't relitigate, we redirect. This hearing is supposedly about fraud in federal programs, not tweets from 2019. And if Vance gets personal, he won't, Stein said. He's vice president, required to maintain decorum. He'll ask procedural questions and delegate the attacking to Republican senators. Omar scrolled through her phone. The squad group chat was already active. AOC posting support, Presley messaging solidarity, Cori Bush sharing threads about Islamophobic rhetoric in congressional hearings. The hashtag #ProtectIlhan was trending. Fundraising emails were queued. The machine was operational. It always operated. Every Republican hearing became a fundraising cycle, a media tour, a narrative renewal. Refugee girl survives war, survives camps, survives Trump, survives the right-wing machine. The attacks made her stronger. That was the entire model. What Omar's team hadn't prepared for, because it never occurred to them to prepare for it, because no Republican had ever done it, was an opponent who could match her poverty story with his own. They'd researched Vance obviously. Yale Law, venture capital, Peter Thiel, senator from Ohio, vice president. The profile of someone born into Republican establishment who'd written a book about poor people to profit from it. That was the frame. Vance is a wealthy Ivy League politician who exploited his community's suffering for profit and now presumes to lecture an actual refugee about struggle. What they hadn't read, or hadn't absorbed carefully enough, was the book itself. They hadn't internalized the mother who overdosed in the Walmart parking lot, the father who signed away parental rights, the grandmother who carried a revolver in her purse and once threatened to kill a man who struck her daughter, the kid who arrived at Marine Corps basic training not knowing how to balance a checkbook. They knew the title Hillbilly Elegy, and they knew the criticism that it blamed poor people for poverty. They didn't know the story, and the story was the weapon. 3 blocks away in a secure office in the Eisenhower Executive Office Building, J.D. Vance sat with his chief of staff and legal counsel reviewing a folder that was notably thin. Not because research was lacking, they'd researched extensively, but because the folder contained almost no financial data, no spreadsheets, no FEC filings. Those were Speaker Johnson's tools. Johnson had already dismantled Omar's financial narrative in his own hearing months earlier, reading the $158,000 to $30 million disclosure jump into the record with a tax accountant's clinical precision. That territory was conquered. Vance's folder contained something different: transcripts, tweets, video timestamps, the public record of Ilhan Omar's own words, not her finances but her statements, things she'd said on camera, on social media, in speeches she chose to deliver about the country that had taken her in. She's going to play the identity card, said his chief of staff Kevin Gallagher, former Marine officer. Islamophobia, xenophobia, targeting immigrants. It's her only move. I know, Vance said, and it's going to bounce off me like a rubber ball off brick because I'm not attacking her identity. I'm reading her words. She'll claim you're privileged, that you can't understand what refugees experience. Vance almost smiled, almost. I grew up in Middletown, Ohio. My mother injected heroin every night. My father didn't exist. I wore second-hand shoes and ate government cheese and joined the Marines because I didn't know what else to do with my life. I'm the least privileged person in that building tomorrow, and everyone in America who read my book knows it. He opened the folder. First page was a transcript from Omar's CAIR speech, March 2019. The relevant passage was highlighted. CAIR was founded after 9/11 because they recognized that some people did something, and that all of us were starting to lose access to our civil liberties. I enlisted because of 9/11, Vance said quietly. Thousands of kids did. Some didn't come home, and she called it "Some people did something." I'm going to read that back to her, and then I'm going to tell her about Mammal. Mammal. My grandmother Bonnie Vance left Kentucky at 13, 8th grade education, worked in factories her entire life, never complained about America, not once, because she remembered what having nothing felt like, and she never forgot this country gave her a chance. He closed the folder. Omar came here as a refugee. My grandmother came to Middletown as a hillbilly. Same story, different ending. I'm going to let America see both endings and decide which one they respect. Gallagher studied him. You're not going to attack her. No, I'm going to tell a story. 2 stories. And the gap between them is going to do all the work. The hearing began at 10. Official title: Oversight of Federal Nutrition Programs, Examining the Feeding Our Future Fraud and Systemic Vulnerabilities in Pandemic-Era Spending. The title was designed to sound bureaucratic. The content would be anything but. First 2 hours were procedural. Witnesses from the Department of Agriculture, the Government Accountability Office, and the FBI's Minneapolis field office testified about the mechanics of the Feeding Our Future fraud. How organizations submitted claims for millions of meals never served. How money was laundered through shell companies and real estate purchases and wire transfers to overseas accounts. How 70 people were charged, and more than 50 convicted in what federal prosecutors called the largest pandemic fraud in American history. The numbers were staggering. $250 million stolen from a program designed to feed children during a pandemic. The organizations were clustered primarily in Minneapolis's Cedar Riverside neighborhood, the heart of the Somali American community Omar represented. The convicted defendants were overwhelmingly Somali descent, though the founder of Feeding Our Future, Amy Bach, was white and had been convicted at trial. Omar listened to testimony with the practiced stillness of a politician who'd been investigated before. Her attorney took notes. Her staff monitored social media. The hearing was proceeding as expected. Dry, procedural, damaging but manageable. Then it was her turn to testify. She took her seat at the witness table and delivered an opening statement that was 7 minutes long, eloquent, constructed on the foundation that had sustained her career. The refugee narrative. I was born in Mogadishu, Somalia, she said. I spent 4 years in a refugee camp in Kenya. I came to this country as a 12-year-old girl who spoke no English. I have been investigated, attacked, threatened, and vilified since the day I took office. And I am here today because the majority party has decided once again to use my community's suffering as a political weapon. She looked at Vance. Mr. Vice President, you sit in that chair, a man born with every advantage in this country, and you dare to use this committee to target a refugee, an immigrant, a Muslim woman, because doing so serves your political agenda. This hearing is not about fraud. It is about fear. Fear of immigrants. Fear of Muslims. Fear of a black woman who dares to speak truth in halls built for people who look like you. The gallery stirred. Progressive groups in the back rows nodded. Omar's staff exchanged satisfied glances. The playbook was working. She'd framed the hearing as an identity attack before a single substantive question had been asked. Vance waited. He let the statement settle the way his grandmother had taught him to let things settle, by not reacting, by letting silence do the work that shouting never can. "Congresswoman," he said, "I need to correct something you stated. You described me as a man born with every advantage. I want to ensure the record is accurate. I was born in Middletown, Ohio, not the good part. The part where the Armco steel mill used to be before it closed and took the town's economy with it. My mother, Beverly, was addicted to heroin and oxycodone. She didn't cycle through rehab once or twice. She cycled through it 18 times. I know because I counted. When you're a kid and your mother disappears, you count the times because counting gives you the illusion that there's a pattern, that maybe this time is the last time. It wasn't. My father signed away his parental rights. I don't say that with anger, I state it as fact. By the time I was in middle school, I had lived in, I'm trying to remember, 4 or 5 different houses, depending on which boyfriend my mother was with. The only constant in my life was my grandmother Mama, who had come to Middletown from Jackson, Kentucky at 13 years old with nothing. No money. No education past 8th grade. No connections. Just a willingness to work in a factory and raise her family. And thank God every night that she lived in a country where a hillbilly girl from Kentucky could do that. I wore shoes from Goodwill. I ate school lunch because it was the biggest meal I'd get. I joined the Marine Corps in 2003 because I didn't know how to fill out a college application, and the recruiter said the Marines would teach me how to be an adult. He was right. He paused, adjusted his microphone slightly, not nervousness, emphasis, a storyteller's timing. So when you say I was born with every advantage, Congresswoman, with deep respect for everything you survived as a child, you're talking to someone who also survived. Different country, same poverty, same broken adults, same fear that tomorrow would be worse than today. The difference between us isn't where we started. We both started at the bottom. The difference is what we chose to do with the chance America gave us. The room shifted. Not the dramatic shift of a courtroom revelation, the quiet shift of an audience recalculating its assumptions. Omar had entered the hearing room as the underdog, refugee versus vice president, powerless versus powerful. In 90 seconds, Vance had collapsed that frame. He wasn't the powerful man attacking the vulnerable woman. He was the other poor kid, the one from the other side of the world's poverty, asking a question that had nothing to do with identity and everything to do with choices. Omar's attorney wrote a note on her legal pad and slid it across the table. Omar glanced at it, didn't acknowledge it. "Mr. Vice President," she said, her voice tighter now, recalibrating, "your personal story is compelling, but it doesn't change the fact that this hearing is being used to target my community." "Congresswoman," Vance said, "I'd like to discuss some of the things you've said during your time in Congress. Not what others have said about you. What you've said. Your words on the record." He opened his folder to the first tab. "On March 23, 2019, you gave a speech at a fundraising event for the Council on American Islamic Relations. In that speech, you described the founding of CAIR and its connection to the September 11th attacks. Your exact words were, CAIR was founded after 9/11 because they recognized that some people did something, and that all of us were starting to lose access to our civil liberties." He looked up from the transcript. "Some people did something. 2,977 people died on September 11, 2001. Firefighters ran upstairs, they knew they wouldn't come down. Office workers called their families to say goodbye from burning buildings. Passengers on Flight 93 stormed the cockpit because they decided they would rather die fighting than die waiting. The towers came down. The Pentagon burned. A field in Pennsylvania became a graveyard. And you described it as some people did something. Congresswoman, I enlisted in the United States Marine Corps in 2003. I was 18 years old. I enlisted because of what happened on September 11th. The way hundreds of thousands of young Americans enlisted because of what happened on September 11th. We didn't enlist for money. We didn't enlist for college, though the GI Bill changed my life. We enlisted because some people did something to our country and we wanted to do something back. I went to Iraq. I was a combat correspondent with the 2nd Marine Aircraft Wing at Al Assad Air Base. I wasn't infantry. I wasn't special forces. I carried an M16 and a camera, and I wrote stories about the Marines I served with. Some of those Marines went to places I didn't go. Some of them didn't come home. And every one of them enlisted for the same reason I did. Because of what happened on September 11th. Not because some people did something. Because terrorists murdered nearly 3,000 Americans, and we decided that deserved a response. You have every right to criticize American foreign policy. I exercise that right myself. I've said publicly that the Iraq War was a mistake. I've been critical of the war on terror's excesses. Dissent is patriotic. But when you describe the worst attack in American history, the reason my friends went to war, as some people did something, you're not dissenting. You're diminishing. You're reducing the murder of nearly 3,000 people to a footnote in your own victimhood narrative. Omar leaned forward. I was talking about the impact on Muslim American civil liberties after 9/11. The surveillance, the profiling, the discrimination. Then say that, Vance said. Say the 9/11 attacks were horrific and the response unfairly targeted Muslim Americans. I would agree with that statement. I would support that statement. But that's not what you said. You said some people did something. You chose those words. And the families of 2,977 people heard you choose them. He turned to the next tab. June 7th, 2021. You posted a statement on Twitter. I'm going to read it exactly as it appeared. We must have the same level of accountability and justice for all victims of crimes against humanity. We have seen unthinkable atrocities committed by the U.S., Hamas, Israel, Afghanistan, and the Taliban. He set the paper down. You put the United States of America in the same sentence as Hamas and the Taliban. The country that took you in as a 12-year-old refugee, that gave you citizenship, education, a congressional seat. You placed it alongside terrorist organizations that stone women, that execute homosexuals, that ban girls from attending school. I served in the Marine Corps with men and women who fought the Taliban, who carried their wounded out of firefights with the Taliban, who came home missing limbs because of the Taliban. And you told the world that their country, the country they bled for, commits the same unthinkable atrocities as the people they were fighting. 12 members of your own party condemned you, not Republicans, Democrats, Jewish Democrats who found the equivalence offensive and dangerous. Speaker Pelosi issued a public statement saying that your comparison, and I'm quoting, foments prejudice. Your own speaker, your own party. You didn't apologize, you clarified. And there's a difference, Congresswoman, between apologizing and clarifying. Apologizing means you understand what you did wrong. Clarifying means you think the problem is that people misunderstood you. But they didn't misunderstand you. They read your words. U.S., Hamas, Israel, Afghanistan, Taliban. Same sentence, same moral framework, we understand perfectly. Omar's composure held, but her rhythm had changed. She was no longer performing the measured outrage of a prepared witness. She was reacting, and reaction in a hearing room is the beginning of the end. You are taking my words out of context to serve a political agenda. I'm reading your words in full, Congresswoman. I'm not editing. I'm not paraphrasing. I'm reading what you wrote on your official account in your own voice for the public to see. If the context changes the meaning, please provide it. I'll wait. She didn't provide it because there was no context that made the sentence read differently. U.S., Hamas, Israel, Afghanistan, Taliban. The words were the words. Vance continued. His voice hadn't changed. It wouldn't change. That was the weapon. Not volume, not aggression, but the steady, warm Appalachian voice of a man telling a story he'd been thinking about for a long time. February 2019, you tweeted that congressional support for Israel was, and I'm quoting, all about the Benjamin's baby. When a journalist asked who you were referring to, you responded with a single word, AIPAC. The implication that Jewish money controls American politics is one of the oldest and most destructive anti-Semitic tropes in existence. It has been used for centuries to justify persecution, exclusion, and violence against Jewish people. The House of Representatives voted 407 to 23 to pass a resolution condemning anti-Semitism. 407 members of Congress of both parties found your statement sufficiently troubling to merit a formal resolution. Your own leadership, Speaker Pelosi, Leader Schumer, Whip Hoyer, publicly called on you to apologize. You did apologize, to your credit. But then you were removed from the House Foreign Affairs Committee in 2023 by a vote of 218 to 211, not because of your religion, not because of your ethnicity, because of a pattern of statements that your own colleagues found unacceptable. Congresswoman, you demand, rightly, that Americans take Islamophobia seriously. I take it seriously. It is real. It is harmful. Muslim Americans deserve to live without fear and without prejudice. But you cannot demand tolerance for yourself while trafficking in prejudice against others. You cannot ask America to protect your community while you deploy tropes that have been used to harm the Jewish community for 1,000 years. Tolerance is not a one-way street. Omar's attorney placed a hand on her arm. A signal, don't respond. Let it pass. Move to the next topic. But Vance was already there. Now I want to talk about why we're actually in this room today. Not your tweets, not your speeches. The $250 million. He pulled a document from his folder. A timeline. Dates, dollar amounts, names, all drawn from federal court records and the Department of Justice's public filings. In 2020, you authored the Meals Act. The purpose of the legislation was to expand access to child nutrition programs during the COVID-19 pandemic. The goal was good. Feeding children during a crisis is something every member of Congress should support. But the bill reduced oversight requirements. It expanded the number of organizations that could access federal food funding without the verification processes that had previously been in place. Critics warned at the time that the reduced safeguards could be exploited. You pushed the bill forward. What happened next is now the subject of the largest pandemic fraud prosecution in American history. Feeding Our Future, a nonprofit operating in your district in the Somali American community you represent, submitted claims for millions of meals that were never prepared, never served, never existed. The money was laundered through shell companies, used to purchase luxury cars, real estate, jewelry. $250 million stolen from a program designed to feed hungry children. More than 70 people have been charged, more than 50 convicted. The majority are members of the Somali American community in Minneapolis, the community you claim to protect. Some of the convicted defendants donated to your campaign. You returned the money after the indictments became public. And in December, the Treasury Department announced an investigation into whether any of the stolen funds were channeled to al-Shabaab, al-Qaeda's affiliate in Somalia. He let that sentence settle. Al-Shabaab, al-Qaeda, Somalia, the country Omar had fled, the country whose warlords had created the refugee crisis that brought her to America. The possibility, still under investigation, not proven, that money stolen from a program she authored might have flowed back to fund the very kind of violence she had escaped. When CBS asked you about the potential terrorism connection, you said, and I'm quoting, "Any link between the alleged fraud and terrorism would be a failure of the FBI." A failure of the FBI. $250 million stolen from a program you authored in your district by members of your community. And your response is to blame the FBI. Congresswoman, when I was in Iraq, we had a saying among the Marines. Every dollar we lose is a bullet someone else buys. If even a fraction of that $250 million reached al-Shabaab, then a program designed to feed American children funded an organization that murders African children. And the congresswoman who authored that program looked at the camera and said it was the FBI's fault. Omar broke, not the way politicians usually break, not with silence, not with a lawyer's hand on her arm. She broke the way she always broke, which was forward into the fight, voice rising. This is racist. This is Islamophobic. You are sitting in that chair targeting a Muslim woman, a black woman, an immigrant, a refugee, because you cannot accept that someone like me has a voice in this government. You are criminalizing my community. You are demonizing immigrants. And you, a man who wrote a book about how poor white people deserve sympathy but immigrants deserve suspicion, you have the audacity to sit there and lecture me about gratitude. The hearing room crackled. Senators on the Democratic side shifted uncomfortably. The accusation of racism from a congresswoman to a vice president on camera in a formal hearing. It was the political equivalent of a grenade with the pin pulled. Vance didn't flinch. He sat the way he'd learned to sit in Middletown, Ohio, when the shouting started. Still, patient, waiting for the storm to pass because storms always pass. And the person who's still standing afterward is the person who didn't try to shout over the thunder. When the echo of her voice faded, he spoke quietly, the Appalachian warmth returning to his voice like heat returning to a room after a door has been closed against the cold. Congresswoman, let me tell you about someone. He wasn't reading from the folder anymore. He was speaking from memory, from the place in his chest where the story lived. Her name was Mammal, Bonnie Vance. She was born in Jackson, Kentucky, in the hollers of eastern Appalachia, where the roads were dirt and the houses didn't have indoor plumbing and the only way out was to leave. She left at 13. She walked out of those hills with nothing. No money, no diploma, no connections, no plan. She got to Middletown, Ohio, and she got a job in a factory. And she married a man who drank too much. And she raised children who struggled. And she raised a grandson who didn't know how to fill out a college application. She was a refugee congresswoman, not from a war zone, from poverty, from a place that America had forgotten. And she came to Middletown the same way you came to Minneapolis, with nothing, hoping that this country would give her a chance. It did. It gave her a factory job and a small house and public schools for her grandchildren, and the right to vote, and the freedom to say whatever she wanted about the government without being arrested or stoned or executed. And you know what she did with that chance. She said thank you, every day, not to a politician, not to a party, to the country. She flew an American flag outside her house. She watched the news every night and argued with the television and loved every minute of it because she knew in her bones the way only someone who has had nothing can know, that the country that gave her a chance was the greatest country on earth. Not perfect, not without flaws, but the greatest, because it took a hillbilly girl from Kentucky and gave her a life. She never sat in Congress. She never gave a speech at CAIR. She never had a Twitter account. She died in 2005 while I was deployed to Iraq, and I didn't get to say goodbye. But if she were sitting in this room today, Congresswoman, I know exactly what she'd say to you. She'd say this country saved your life. Act like it. The hearing room was silent. The silence of 50 people simultaneously understanding that they were no longer watching a policy hearing. They were watching two American stories collide. Middletown and Mogadishu, Appalachia and East Africa. The grandson of a hillbilly and the daughter of a civil servant who fled a war. And the collision was not about policy or party or identity. It was about something older and simpler and more dangerous than any of those things. It was about whether the right response to being saved is gratitude or grievance. You and I both came from nothing, Congresswoman, Vance said. We both know what hunger feels like. We both know what it's like to be a child who doesn't know if the adults will be there tomorrow. We both got a chance that billions of people on this earth will never get. I put on a uniform. I went to Iraq. I came home. I used the GI Bill to go to college and then law school. I wrote a book about the place I came from, not to tear it down but to understand it. And every morning I wake up grateful, genuinely, deeply grateful, that I live in the only country on earth that would have given a kid from Middletown, Ohio, a kid with a drug-addicted mother and a missing father and shoes from Goodwill, the chance to become Vice President of the United States. You came here as a 12-year-old girl with nothing, and this country gave you safety when Somalia couldn't, citizenship when you were stateless, education when you were illiterate in English, the right to vote, the right to run for office, and a seat in the United States Congress. And from that seat, you called the worst attack on American soil some people did something. You compared our military to the Taliban. You deployed anti-Semitic rhetoric that 407 of your colleagues condemned. You authored a bill that created a $250 million fraud pipeline in your own community. And when the Treasury Department began investigating whether that money funded terrorism in the country you fled, you blamed the FBI. Congresswoman, I am not questioning your right to be here. You are an American citizen. You were duly elected. Your seat in Congress is yours. I am not questioning your religion. Islam is a great faith and Muslim Americans are part of the fabric of this nation. I am questioning what you did with the gift of being here. Because America gave us both a gift, the same gift. And the question this hearing asks, the question your constituents are asking, the question the families of the 9/11 victims are asking, the question that Marine veteran sitting in the third row of this gallery is asking, is whether you received that gift with gratitude or with contempt. America doesn't ask for gratitude. It never has. You can criticize this country from morning to night. That's your right. And it's one of the things that makes this country worth defending. But there is a line between criticism and contempt. And when you describe the murder of nearly 3,000 people as something, when you equate the United States military with the Taliban, when a program you wrote is exploited for $250 million, and you blame the people investigating it instead of the people who stole the money, you have crossed that line. And the saddest part, Congresswoman, is that the people who pay the price aren't you. It's the Somali Americans in Cedar Riverside who came here for the same reason you did, for safety, for opportunity, for a chance, and who are now associated with a $250 million fraud they had nothing to do with. It's the Muslim Americans who wake up every day grateful to live in a country that protects their right to worship freely, and who cringe every time you make a statement that confirms every stereotype their neighbors already have. It's the immigrants from Vietnam, from Cuba, from Nigeria, from Mexico, who took the citizenship oath with tears in their eyes because they remembered what they left behind, and who watch you take that same oath and wonder if you remember at all. He looked at her one last time. Two kids who grew up with nothing. Two adults who were given everything by the same country. One said thank you. One said some people did something. I yield to the committee. Omar stood. Her attorney reached for her arm. She pulled away. You don't get to tell an immigrant how to feel about this country, she said. You don't get to weaponize your poverty against mine. You don't get to use your grandmother's story to silence a refugee. I have fought for my community since the day I arrived in this country, and I will not be lectured by a man who wrote a book blaming poor people for being poor, and then used that book to get rich. Vance's response was 6 words. I'm not telling you how to feel, Congresswoman. I'm reading what you said. Your words, on your Twitter account, in your speeches, in legislation you authored. I didn't write your tweets. I didn't write the Meals Act. I didn't make the comparison to the Taliban. You did, and the American people can decide for themselves what those words say about your relationship with the country that saved your life. The chairman gavelled the hearing to a close. Omar gathered her papers, though she hadn't looked at them once, and walked out of the hearing room without stopping for cameras. Her staff followed. Her attorney followed. The hallway was full of reporters, but she turned left and kept walking. And for the first time in her congressional career, Ilhan Omar had nothing to say to the press. The clip traveled the way all clips travel now, in fragments, each optimized for a different audience and a different emotional frequency. The first fragment was the mammal story, 63 seconds, Vance describing his grandmother leaving Kentucky at 13, working in factories, flying the American flag, saying thank you every day. Someone found a photograph of the Vance house in Middletown, small, white siding, American flag hanging from the porch. The photo was shared alongside Omar's "Some People Did Something" clip. No commentary. The juxtaposition was the commentary. The second fragment was the closing. America doesn't ask for gratitude, but it deserves better than contempt. 14 words. 62 million views in 48 hours. It was printed on T-shirts. It was quoted in church sermons. It was painted on a mural outside a VFW hall in Scranton, Pennsylvania. It became, for a brief and intense period of the American attention cycle, the most repeated sentence in the country. The third fragment, the one that did damage Omar's team hadn't anticipated, the one that couldn't be neutralized by the playbook, was the response from immigrants. It started with a Vietnamese-American woman in Orange County, California, who recorded a 60-second video on her phone. She was 71 years old. She had come to America in 1979 after the fall of Saigon in a fishing boat with 37 other people. She spoke with an accent and tears in her eyes. "I know what it means to be a refugee. I spent 3 weeks on the ocean. We had no food. We had no water. People died on that boat. America took us in. America saved my family. When that woman says some people did something, she does not speak for me. She does not speak for any refugee I know. We are grateful. We will always be grateful." The video was viewed 14 million times in 3 days. A Cuban-American man in Miami, a professor of political science at Florida International University, whose parents had fled Castro in 1962, wrote an op-ed that was syndicated in 40 newspapers. "My mother kissed the ground at Miami International Airport. She told me that story every year on the anniversary of our arrival. She kissed the ground because she knew what we had left behind and what America had given us. Gratitude was not optional in our house. It was the foundation of everything." A Nigerian-American surgeon in Houston posted on social media, "I took the citizenship oath in 2009. I cried, not because I was sad, because I remembered the village I came from where the clinic had no electricity and children died of diseases that cost $4 to cure in America. I cried because I was thankful. She took the same oath. I wonder if she cried." A Gold Star mother from New Jersey, whose son had enlisted in the Marines after September 11th and died in Afghanistan at 22, gave an interview to a local news station. She held a photograph of her son in his dress blues. She said one sentence that was shorter and more devastating than anything said in the hearing room. "My boy died because of what some people did. He was 22. She called his reason for serving something." The immigrant response became its own phenomenon, not organized, not coordinated, not partisan. It came from Vietnamese and Cuban and Nigerian and Filipino and Mexican and Indian and Haitian Americans who had one thing in common. They remembered what they had left behind, and they were grateful for what they had found. And they were furious, not at Vance, not at Republicans, but at the idea that Ilhan Omar spoke for them, that her contempt was their contempt, that her grievance was their grievance. "She makes us look ungrateful," said a Somali-American shopkeeper in Cedar Riverside, Omar's own neighborhood, 2 blocks from the Feeding Our Future offices that were now shuttered and padlocked. "We are not ungrateful. We came here because we love this country. She came here and she forgot why." Omar held a press conference 4 hours after the hearing. She was flanked by 3 squad members and 2 civil rights attorneys. She called the hearing the most Islamophobic, xenophobic display of hatred I have witnessed in my time in Congress. She called Vance a man who wrote a book blaming the poor for poverty, and now uses the vice presidency to bully immigrants. She called the Mammal story emotional manipulation, designed to obscure the fact that this administration is targeting Muslim communities. The statement was factually precise in the way political statements always are when the underlying facts are indefensible. She addressed the framing. She did not address some people did something. She did not address the Taliban comparison. She did not address the $250 million. She did not address the immigrant responses. She did not address Mammal. And by the time the press conference aired, 60 million people had already watched the Mammal clip, which meant that 60 million people noticed what she didn't say. The Islamophobia defense encountered a structural problem it had never encountered before. The man on the other side of the table was not a wealthy Yale-educated Republican in a suit. He was, or he had been, a kid from Middletown, Ohio, who wore Goodwill shoes and ate government cheese and joined the Marines because he didn't know what else to do. He had deployed to Iraq. He had used the GI Bill. He had climbed out of poverty the same way immigrants climb out of poverty, by working, by serving, by refusing to quit. And when he spoke about gratitude, he spoke from the same place Omar spoke from when she talked about suffering, from experience. You can call a rich man's patriotism privilege. You can call a powerful man's gratitude performance. But when a man tells you that his mother was a drug addict and his father abandoned him and he wore second-hand shoes and he thanks America anyway, You cannot call that privilege. You can only call it a choice. And the choice is what the hearing was about. In the weeks that followed, the word ungrateful attached itself to Omar the way emails had attached to Clinton and weapons had attached to Iraq, not as a proven fact but as a frame, a lens through which everything she said would now be viewed. It wasn't a word Vance had used. He was too disciplined for that. He had used contempt, which was more precise and more difficult to rebut. But the public heard contempt and translated it into the simpler, sharper word. And the word stuck because it connected to something real. The gap between what America had given Ilhan Omar and what she had given back. She entered the hearing room as a refugee who had survived everything. She left as a woman who had been given everything and thanked no one. Not because Vance attacked her. Not because he insulted her religion or her ethnicity or her community, but because he told two stories, his and his grandmother's, and placed them next to hers, and let America see the difference. Two poverties, two chances, two choices, one flag on a porch in Middletown, one tweet that said some people did something, and a country watching the way countries always watch when the question is not about policy or party but about something deeper. About whether the right response to being saved is to say thank you or to say you could have done better. Mama would have known the answer. She always did. 3 weeks after the hearing, the political landscape had fundamentally shifted. Not in the way shifts usually happen in Washington, gradually, through polls and focus groups and consultant memos. This shift was visceral, immediate. The kind that happens when a story breaks through the noise and lodges itself in the collective consciousness. The Republican Party didn't need to run ads. The clip was the ad. Mama's story on repeat across social media, shared by people who'd never shared a political video in their lives. Grandmothers in Kentucky, factory workers in Ohio, veterans in VFW halls from Maine to California. They shared it not because a consultant told them to, but because they saw themselves, or they saw their parents, or they saw the America they believed in. The one that takes broken people and gives them a chance to build something. The Democratic Party tried to counter. They deployed surrogates. They wrote op-eds. They organized rallies in Minneapolis where speakers reminded crowds that Ilhan Omar was a refugee, a survivor, a voice for the voiceless. But the defense kept circling back to the same problem. To defend Omar, they had to talk about what Vance had said. And every time they talked about what Vance had said, they amplified his message. It's the oldest rule in political communications. Don't repeat your opponent's attack. But how do you defend against an attack that isn't an attack? Vance hadn't insulted Omar, hadn't questioned her citizenship, hadn't mentioned her hijab or her skin color or her religion except to defend it. He'd read her words. He'd told his grandmother's story. And then he'd let America decide. The squad held an emergency strategy session in AOC's office. 5 members, 3 attorneys, 2 communications directors, all trying to solve a problem that couldn't be solved with the usual tools. We need to reframe this, AOC said. Make it about his privilege. Yale Law, venture capital. He's not the hillbilly he claims to be. Rashida Tlaib shook her head. That doesn't work. Everyone knows his story. They've read the book. And the moment we attack his background, we're doing exactly what he accused Ilhan of doing, making it about identity instead of substance. Then we attack the substance, Ayanna Pressley said. The feeding our future fraud wasn't Ilhan's fault. She wrote a bill to feed children. Criminals exploited it. That's on them, not her. Cori Bush nodded. Exactly. We pivot to that. The real story is Republican cruelty. They're using this fraud to demonize an entire community. But Omar, sitting at the end of the table, wasn't nodding. She was staring at her phone, scrolling through the immigrant responses that kept multiplying. Vietnamese, Cuban, Nigerian, Somali, all saying the same thing in different languages. We are grateful. She does not speak for us. It's not working, Omar said quietly. The room went silent. The identity defense isn't working, she continued, because he matched my identity with his, poverty with poverty, struggle with struggle. And then he asked the question I can't answer. What did you do with the opportunity? She looked up from her phone. I can't answer it because the answer is in the record. Some people did something, the Taliban comparison, the Benjamin's tweet, the Meals Act, it's all there. And every time I try to defend it, I sound like I'm making excuses, like I'm asking for special treatment because I'm a refugee. Rachel, what do I do? Her attorney, Rachel Stein, had been quiet through the entire discussion. She was quiet now, thinking, calculating, running through options the way lawyers do when they're trying to find a path through a minefield. Finally, she spoke. You can't win this by defending what you said. The words are the words. You can't recontextualize some people did something. You can't explain away the Taliban comparison. You can't make the Benjamin's tweet not anti-Semitic. What you can do is acknowledge it, own it, say you were wrong, say you've learned, say you understand why those words hurt people, and then pivot to what you've done for your community that actually matters. Omar shook her head. If I apologize now, after the hearing, it looks like he broke me. Like I'm only saying it because he embarrassed me. Stein leaned forward. Ilhan, you've been in Congress for 6 years. You've never given a full, unqualified apology for any of these statements. You've clarified, you've contextualized, you've explained, but you've never just said I was wrong and I'm sorry. Maybe that's the problem. The silence that followed was the silence of people who know the truth but don't want to say it out loud. Because to apologize would be to admit that Vance was right, that there is a difference between criticism and contempt, that gratitude matters, that America, for all its flaws, deserves better than some people did something. And if Omar admitted that, what would be left of her brand, of her identity as the unapologetic voice speaking truth to power, of the narrative that had carried her from a refugee camp in Kenya to the United States Congress? The meeting ended without a decision, because some problems don't have solutions, they have consequences. In Middletown, Ohio, J.D. Vance's childhood home had become a pilgrimage site, not officially. No one had organized it, but people came anyway. They took photos of the small white house with the American flag. They left flowers on the porch. They wrote notes. Thank you for telling Mama's story. My grandmother was the same. My grandfather came from Appalachia. Same struggle, same gratitude. I'm a refugee from Vietnam. Your grandmother sounds like my mother. The city of Middletown, which had spent decades as a punchline, a symbol of Rust Belt decay and opioid despair, suddenly found itself recast as something else. The place that made J.D. Vance. The place that proved that America still works for people willing to work for it. The mayor, a Democrat who'd been skeptical of Vance's politics, gave an interview to the New York Times. Whatever you think of his policies, he told the truth about this town. We were dying. We're still struggling. But people here, they don't give up. They work. They take care of their families. They fly the flag. And yeah, they're grateful to live in America, even when America forgets about them. Is Vance right about Ilhan Omar? The mayor paused. I don't know Ilhan Omar, but I know Middletown. And I know that when you come from nothing and this country gives you a chance, you remember it. You honor it. Maybe she does, but if she does, she should say so. In Minneapolis, Cedar Riverside, the heart of the Somali-American community, the mood was complicated. Angry at Republicans for using the fraud to demonize an entire community. Angry at the criminals who'd stolen the money and confirmed every stereotype. And angry, though few said it publicly, at Ilhan Omar for not being more careful. A Somali-American imam gave a sermon that was recorded and shared online. We came to America as refugees, he said, like Congresswoman Omar, like many of you. We came because our country failed us, because warlords destroyed Somalia, because we needed safety. America gave us that safety. It gave us jobs. It gave us schools for our children. It gave us the freedom to practice our faith without fear. And yes, it also gave us problems, discrimination, Islamophobia, poverty. We are not blind to America's flaws, but we are also not blind to its gifts. When someone speaks for our community, we expect them to speak with wisdom, with gratitude, with an understanding that the world is watching and judging us by their words. Some people did something. Those words hurt us, because they suggest we don't understand what September 11th means to Americans. They suggest we don't care. They suggest we are ungrateful. We are not ungrateful. He paused, looking out at the congregation. If Congresswoman Omar wants to speak for us, she must speak like someone who remembers where we came from and why we are grateful to be here. The sermon went viral in Somali American communities across the country. It was translated into Somali and Arabic. It was shared in mosques from Columbus to Seattle, and it represented something Omar's team had feared but not prepared for. Her own community, not abandoning her but asking her to be better. Meanwhile, in Washington, the political class was recalibrating. Democratic leadership was quietly distancing. No more joint appearances with Omar. No more public defenses. When asked about the hearing, they gave carefully worded statements about supporting all members of their caucus while also respecting the legitimate concerns raised about accountability and rhetoric. Republican leadership was doing the opposite, amplifying. Vance's favorability numbers had jumped 15 points in swing states. He was being invited to speak at events from Iowa to New Hampshire. The presidential speculation, which had been simmering since Trump won re-election, was now boiling. Can Vance win in 2028? That was the question being asked in donor meetings and strategy sessions. And the answer, post-hearing, was increasingly yes. Because Vance had done something Republicans had been trying to do for a decade. He'd neutralized the identity defense. He'd shown that you can challenge a minority politician on substance without being called racist, that you can tell your own poverty story to match theirs, that you can ask hard questions about gratitude without apologizing for asking. And he'd done it all without raising his voice, without insulting, without the performative cruelty that had defined Republican politics in the Trump era. He just told a story about his grandmother and let America decide. 3 months after the hearing, Ilhan Omar gave an interview to The Atlantic. It was her first major interview since that day in the Senate hearing room. The reporter asked the question everyone wanted answered. Do you regret saying some people did something? Omar looked at the recorder on the table between them, took a breath. I regret how it was heard, she said. I regret that it hurt people. I regret that it was used to suggest I don't care about the victims of September 11th. But do you regret saying it? Another pause, longer this time. I was making a point about civil liberties, about how Muslim Americans lost rights after the attacks. That's important. That needs to be said. The reporter waited, didn't fill the silence. Finally, Omar continued. But I should have said it differently. I should have acknowledged the horror of that day first. The nearly 3,000 people who died, the families who lost everything, the firefighters who ran up those stairs knowing they wouldn't come down. I should have said that first, and then I should have talked about civil liberties. So you regret how you said it, not what you said. Omar looked directly at the reporter. I regret that I gave people like J.D. Vance ammunition to question whether I understand what it means to be American, because I do understand. I understand better than most people because I've lived the alternative. I've lived in a country where the government murders its own citizens, where there's no rule of law, where being the wrong tribe means death. I came to America because it's different, better, and I'm grateful for that every day. Then why not say so? Because, Omar said, and her voice was quieter now, more honest, when you're from where I'm from, when you've survived what I've survived, gratitude feels like submission. Like you're supposed to be quiet and thankful and never challenge anything because they let you in. And I refuse to be quiet, even when being quiet would be smarter. The interview was published with the headline Ilhan Omar on gratitude, survival, and why she won't be quiet. It was shared widely, discussed extensively, and it changed exactly nothing. Because the problem wasn't whether Omar felt grateful. The problem was that she'd never said it. Not in 6 years in Congress, not in hundreds of speeches and thousands of tweets, not even after the hearing when saying it might have mattered. And now, 3 months later, saying it in an Atlantic interview felt like exactly what it was. Too little, too late, a response to political pressure rather than genuine reflection. The article that ran the next day in the National Review captured it perfectly. Ilhan Omar says she's grateful, but she's only saying it now because J.D. Vance forced her to. That's not gratitude. That's damage control. Real gratitude doesn't wait for a vice president to embarrass you in a Senate hearing. Real gratitude is a flag on your porch, and thank you in your heart even when no one's watching. Mammal had that, Omar doesn't. And America can tell the difference. In the year that followed, two things happened that would define both of their political futures. First, Ilhan Omar won re-election in Minnesota's 5th District by 14 points, a commanding victory that proved her base was still solid, that Minneapolis still supported her, that the hearing hadn't destroyed her career, but her influence had diminished. She was no longer invited to speak at major progressive conferences, no longer featured in party strategy sessions, no longer seen as a future leader but as a liability, someone who'd peaked early and become more trouble than she was worth. The squad remained loyal publicly, but privately, even they acknowledged what everyone could see. Omar had lost the argument, not because Republicans had beaten her, because J.D. Vance had matched her story with his own and asked a question she couldn't answer. What did you do with the opportunity? Second, J.D. Vance announced he was running for president in 2028. The announcement came from Middletown, Ohio, in front of the house where Mammal raised him. The American flag was still hanging from the porch. His announcement speech was 23 minutes long. He spent the first 5 minutes talking about his mother's addiction, his father's absence, his grandmother's sacrifices. The same story he'd told in the hearing room but expanded, deepened, made more personal. Then he pivoted. America is the only country in the world where a kid like me gets to run for president. The only country where poverty is not destiny, where your last name doesn't determine your future, where what matters is not where you started but what you do with the chance you're given. My grandmother understood that. She flew that flag every day because she knew what America had given her, and she taught me to be grateful. Gratitude doesn't mean you don't criticize. It doesn't mean you don't fight for change. It doesn't mean you ignore problems. It means you understand the difference between a country that has flaws and a country that is flawed, between a nation that makes mistakes and a nation that is a mistake. America makes mistakes. We've made many, we'll make more. But America is not a mistake. It's a miracle. The miracle that took a hillbilly girl from Kentucky and gave her a life. The miracle that took a refugee from Somalia and gave her a seat in Congress. The miracle that took a kid from Middletown with nothing and gave him a chance to stand here today. Some people look at that miracle and say thank you. Some people look at that miracle and say some people did something. I'm running for president because I believe America deserves leaders who say thank you. The speech went viral immediately, shared by Republicans and Democrats, by immigrants and native-born Americans, by people who'd never voted Republican in their lives but found themselves nodding along. Because the message wasn't partisan, it was human. It was the story of every person who'd ever climbed out of poverty and looked back and felt grateful, who'd ever gotten a chance they didn't deserve and promised themselves they'd make it count. It was Mama's story, and it was America's story, and J.D. Vance had learned from both. The polls that followed showed Vance leading every potential Democratic opponent, not by huge margins, not in every state, but enough to make strategists nervous, enough to make donors pay attention, enough to make people wonder if the kid from Middletown might actually pull it off. And in Minneapolis, in a small congressional office in Cedar Riverside, Ilhan Omar watched the announcement speech on her computer, watched the crowd cheer, watched the flag wave behind him, watched him tell the story that had beaten her. She didn't say anything, didn't post on social media, didn't call her staff. She just sat there, watching, as the man who'd read her words back to her prepared to run for the highest office in the land on a message of gratitude. And she wondered, maybe for the first time, if he'd been right. If the opportunity America had given her demanded something in return, not silence, not submission, but acknowledgement, recognition, gratitude, the kind Mammal had shown every day of her life, the kind Omar had never quite learned to show. Because when you come from a war zone, gratitude feels like weakness, like admitting the people who let you in are better than the people you left behind, like betraying everyone who didn't make it out. But what if it wasn't betrayal? What if it was just truth? What if saying thank you to America didn't mean forgetting Somalia? What if it just meant remembering both, the horror you escaped and the hope you found? What if the right response to being saved wasn't to prove you deserved it? What if it was just to say thank you and mean it? These were the questions Ilhan Omar asked herself in the quiet of her office, alone, after the speech ended and the screen went dark. And the fact that she was asking them at all, 3 years after the hearing, meant that J.D. Vance had already won. Not the argument, not the debate, but something deeper. He'd changed the question, from who has the right to criticize America to what do you owe the country that saved you? And that question, once asked, couldn't be unasked. It would follow Omar for the rest of her career, follow every immigrant politician who came after her, follow anyone who'd ever been given a chance and had to decide whether to say thank you or demand more. Mama knew the answer. She'd known it in her bones. In the Kentucky hills where she was born and the Middletown factory where she worked and the small house where she raised a grandson, the answer was gratitude. Not blind gratitude, not silent gratitude, but real, honest, bone-deep gratitude for the miracle of a country that gives people chances. Some people get that naturally. They kiss the ground at the airport. They fly the flag on their porch. They tear up at baseball games when the anthem plays. Some people have to learn it, have to be reminded, have to be asked the question by a vice president in a Senate hearing room. What did you do with the opportunity this country gave you? Ilhan Omar was still learning. J.D. Vance was already teaching. And America was watching to see which story would win. The hillbilly's granddaughter who said thank you every day, or the refugee's daughter who said some people did something. Two stories, two choices, two Americas. One flag hanging from a porch in Middletown, Ohio. One woman sitting in an office in Minneapolis, wondering if maybe, just maybe, she should have said it differently, should have said it better, should have said thank you. Mama would have known. She always did. If you found this story compelling, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss the next deep dive into the moments that define American politics. The moments where personal history collides with public office, where poverty meets power, where gratitude confronts grievance, and where two people who both started with nothing show us what happens when America gives you everything. One said thank you. The other said some people did something. Which response would you choose? Let me know in the comments below. And remember, these aren't just political stories. They're American stories, and they're still being written.